Good afternoon. I would like to begin by thanking the Center for English Translation and Anglo-Portuguese Studies, as well as the coordinators of the Utopia 500 project for the opportunity and platform to share some utopian, but at the same time, practical and easy to implement ideas that I believe have the potential to influence individuals and groups they're part of, and thus act as drivers of meaningful social change. Never before was it possible to reach and influence so many people all over the world at once. As of April this year, there were over 5 billion social media users worldwide, which makes up around 62.6% of the total global population. It seems a mixed blessing, to say the least, for if a platform like this is used to spread misinformation, populist agendas, and increase societal polarization, which is happening on an unprecedented scale right now, it becomes yet another serious problem humanity has to face. Armies of trolls and AI bots influence elections, policymaking, and public sentiment all over the world. And if that wasn't enough, numerous human users join in the dissemination of irrational attitudes. Irrational decision-making and misinformation, in turn, make solving the world's most pressing problems, such as climate change and the decline of democracy, even more difficult, as they contribute to limiting public awareness of the severity of these problems and our engagement in pressuring the policymakers to drive significant change. The 2022 Eurostat Handbook for Handling Disinformation goes as far as to remark that the rapid proliferation of disinformation has rocked the foundations of many institutions underpinning democratic values and order in society. Does it mean that humanity is doomed to destroy itself and other species on the planet as it goes? Well, unfortunately, I don't have a definitive answer to this question, but I know that there are measures that we can and should take to make people more immune to online misinformation. And the good news is that these measures are fairly simple and proven to be effective. A lot of social media misinformation is based on argumentation involving logical fallacies and cognitive biases. Logical fallacies can be defined as errors in reasoning and argumentation that have the appearance of soundness, while cognitive biases are systematic errors in the way individuals reason about the world due to subjective perception of reality. And it's important to note that all humans, especially those without knowledge of their existence, are prone to making this kind of errors in logical reasoning and argumentation. These are the default settings. Our slowly evolving brains are hardwired to that have little to do with a person's intelligence, their level of education, or expertise in their field. And let me give you some examples. We'll begin with logical fallacies, which are like tricks or mistakes that people make in their thinking when trying to prove a point. They're arguments that seem convincing, but don't really make sense when we think about them carefully. It's like using shortcuts that may sound right, but actually lead to wrong conclusions. The ad hominem fallacy occurs whenever someone attacks the person rather than their argument. And if you've ever participated in a discussion on social media, then you've probably experienced it firsthand. Here's Greta Thunberg holding a cardboard sign calling for immediate climate justice. And of course, it is extremely difficult, if not impossible, to come up with reasonable arguments to oppose her demands. But some people appear to feel such a strong need to disagree with her anyway, that they resort to attacking her perceived or imaginary personal traits instead of the arguments that she uses. Some of the comments that we're about to see and discuss include linguistic errors, but I'm going to read them mostly as they were written, for the meaning seems to be clear anyway. And the first user replies as follows: more self-marketing than save the climate, but a person with autism has sometimes the need to get attention. And of course, the fact that Greta Thunberg is on the autistic spectrum doesn't mean that her actions are motivated by attention seeking and that they should be dismissed as unreasonable. And let's have a look at another comment. Veronica writes, I don't understand. If you're so much for climate change, why do you jet around in fossil fuel jets instead of taking a boat or a car? And of course, one doesn't have to be 100% eco-friendly to be able to make claims about the need for climate justice. So again, this is not a reasonable argument to support the thesis that we should not fight for climate justice. It's just a personal attack performed instead of using a logical argument. There's more. Poster child for birth control, John writes. How dare you? You should have a real job, comments another person. She's a nutter and needs to get a life. That's just, a plainly offensive language used instead of an argument. Find a job. Poor little misinformed child. It's not your fault, sweetheart, writes another person. And this ad hominem attack seems particularly insidious to me because it is masked as care, while in fact this person is trying to convey the point that she's too young to know anything and that she's misinformed, and therefore all her claims can be dismissed. Another person writes, go to school. And to that, somebody else replies, great advice from someone who obviously wasted their education. And this example proves the point that regardless on which side of ideological debates people find themselves on, we are all prone to making this kind of errors in logical reasoning and argumentation, especially when we feel some kind of emotional attachment to an issue and we want real hard to argue in favor of or against a thesis. There's more. Get to school, get a job. And of course, there were also positive comments supporting her claim. I just selected examples of the ad hominem fallacy to show how often they're used in internet conversations, especially on social media. The good news about the ad hominem attack is that whenever people start attacking you instead of your claims, it means that they don't have any reasonable arguments to support their viewpoints and are in fact losing the discussion. It's also useful to bear in mind that some seasoned conversationalists may use this type of fallacious argumentation to trigger an emotional response in their interlocutors on purpose to make them seem less professional to the audience. So, what to do when confronted with this kind of personal attack in real life or in an internet discussion? State the facts, meaning explain that the person is using a logical fallacy instead of a reasonable argument. Explain that they're actually attacking the person rather than the argument, and ask if they could present any reasonable arguments instead. Usually works. And we're moving on to another fallacy really commonly used in all kinds of internet discussions, but particularly often in the context of the climate crisis. And this is the anecdotal evidence fallacy. The anecdotal fallacy occurs whenever someone uses a personal experience or an isolated example instead of a sound argument or compelling evidence. The link to this article was posted on The Economist's Facebook fan page in the beginning of July this year. And the lead to the article says, this summer looks set to be punishing in the Northern Hemisphere. Global average temperatures have broken records every month for the past year. Despite this, many countries are doing too little to combat the heat. And to that, some users decided to respond with anecdotes based on isolated examples failing to remember and take into account the basic distinction between weather and climate. While weather is local and can change really quickly, climate is the average over space and time. So the fact that the weather is one way or other at a given point in space and time doesn't tell us anything about climate trends, and therefore cannot be used as an argument against the need to increase efforts on mitigating the disastrous effects of climate change. And some of the comments are as follows. Here in France, we have 17 degrees Celsius during the day. I wouldn't say the Seine is going to boil soon. Of course, the fact that the weather at a given day in the summer in France is one way or other doesn't tell us anything about the climate and cannot be used as an argument against enormous amounts of evidence that climate change is real and that it is caused by humans. Let's have a look at some more commonly used arguments in quotation marks that under closer inspection turn out to be logical fallacies. Well, tell that to the Dutch after 7 months of rain and cold. So far, this summer has been awful, so still waiting. And the comment left by Theodor Tonica is particularly interesting, for it combines two types of fallacious argumentation in one sentence. And he writes, yes, in Germany, where I live, 13 degrees today. Are you stupid or brainwashed? So here we have the anecdotal evidence fallacy combined with, or rather put in the form of a loaded question. A loaded question is a question that cannot be answered without appearing guilty, because what can you say to a question, are you stupid or brainwashed? Not much choice left there. And there are more arguments like that. Aha, coldest summer I've ever known. Global warming my left foot. It was 14 degrees here yesterday. The next fallacy on our agenda is the appeal to authority. And in this kind of illogical argumentation, one assumes that because someone in a position of authority believes something, it must automatically be correct, even if the authority figure's expertise is not directly linked or not relevant to the topic in question. This fallacy is really often used in advertising, media, and politics, where people use authority figures to sway public opinion without providing substantive evidence. While definitely an expert on football and social media marketing, Cristiano Ronaldo cannot be trusted as a qualified source of information about alkaline water, especially since, according to Harvard Health and other reputable sources, there is not any evidence to support choosing bottled or home-treated alkaline water over safe tap water or regular bottled water. But still, here the advertisement tries to create the impression that if you drink this particular brand of water, you will be as successful as Cristiano Ronaldo. And another example of an appeal to authority, this time from a different social media platform, from Instagram. Here we have Count Colgata sharing his tips on oral hygiene. And it has to do with the fact that since the 1st of January last year, 2023, actors are banned from playing not only doctors, but any other medical professionals as well, including pharmacists in advertising. And so the well-known trope of 9 per 10 dentists who recommend a particular brand of toothpaste gives way to a new wave of appeals to other kinds of expert authority on this kind of topics. So in this humorous Instagram video, mimicking the Get Ready With Me formula, popular among social media influencers, Count Kolgata shares some tips on avoiding teeth stains without the need to resign from drinking red wine, as he explains. And this brings us to another fallacy still, the strawman fallacy. It's another example of illogical argumentation, extremely popular in all kinds of internet discussions, especially on controversial issues, and amounts to twisting the interlocutor's argument or even completely inventing a different version of what is being said to make it easier to attack. And even though I keep mentioning discussions on social media, by no means are these fallacies restricted to social media only, because we can encounter the strawman fallacy in family relationships, in arguments or heated discussions that arise in interpersonal relationships of all kinds. And the strawman fallacy happens whenever someone misrepresents what is being said to make it easier to attack. And let's have a look at some real life examples again. Here we have another article from The Economist, and the lead to this article reads, in much of the developed world, younger women are becoming sharply more liberal, while their male peers are not. These diverging worldviews could affect politics, families, and more. And let's have a look at the comments. Richard Cooper writes, now that women no longer need a man to validate their existence, society needs to adapt. Men need to realize that the old tropes of being the breadwinner with a dutiful wife at home are no longer valid or desirable. They need to grow up and accept that. And to that, another commenter replies, so you're saying you wouldn't want to take care of your woman and help support her? Let's have another look at the previous comment. Nowhere in his statement does Richard Cooper say that he wouldn't want to take care of his partner or help support her. He simply says that some long-standing tropes and thoughts about what's acceptable in a society and whatnot have shifted, and we need to adjust because the world is different. So that's an example of the strawman fallacy. And another one comes from a different social media platform still. That's from TikTok, where in a 2020 video, Kamala Harris says, quote, our climate crisis is not a partisan issue and it is not a hoax. It is an existential threat to all of us, particularly poor communities and communities of color who bear the greatest risks from polluted air, polluted water, and a failing infrastructure, unquote. Again, what she's referring to shouldn't be up for debate, as it's a matter of unprecedented scientific consensus. Already in 2021, over 99% of peer-reviewed papers in the field of climate sciences agreed that the climate crisis was a real existential threat to humanity and that it is caused by human activity. And since it is impossible to argue with this amount of reliable data using logical arguments, people who still fail to face up to this difficult reality often resort to using the strawman fallacy to misrepresent what people are saying, to make it sound silly and therefore easy to attack as an unreasonable position. Let's have a look at the examples. CBS News informs that she said what she said, namely that climate change poses the biggest threat to poor communities and communities of color. And to that, one of the commenters replies, Ha ha ha. So now climate change is racist? Of course, no one said anything like it. Another comment goes as follows. Poor communities where 2 blocks over is the middle class, so the pollution only hovers over the poor in the city? Again, she never said anything like it. So now a hurricane will pick what race to hit the hardest. Girl, bye, writes another internet user. And of course, if somebody said that a hurricane picks which race to hit the hardest, then definitely it would be a silly and easily arguable position. However, this is completely not what she said. And yet another example of a fallacy particularly often used in internet discussions on controversial topics is the slippery slope fallacy that occurs whenever someone claims that if we allow one thing to happen, an extreme hypothetical will automatically follow next, so the first thing should never be allowed to occur. And here we have a post from the BBC informing about the legalization of same-sex marriage in Australia. And again, let's have a look at some comments, this time using the slippery slope fallacy to argue against marriage equality. And the first one is so exaggerated, I find it difficult to take seriously. But then again, it is a prime example of a slippery slope fallacy. The commenter writes, disgraceful. Next, they will be forcing elephants to marry goldfish. So if we allow same-sex marriages, then next, some mysterious they will be forcing elephants to marry goldfish. The second comment is even more interesting, I'd say, because here it is not so direct. The author is trying to suggest that Australia's legalization of same-sex marriage will have an extreme, irrational, and completely implausible consequence, namely that people will stop having kids in Australia whatsoever. And the second comment reads as follows. That's nice. So how are they going to produce kids? They're sparsely populated already. And there's a third comment or a third exchange rather in this discussion. And even though it doesn't contain the slippery slope fallacy, it is interesting to examine because it is another example of a person failing to successfully argue their point by resorting to using a logical fallacy themselves. So here one commenter writes, they will face the consequences of this evil law. And to that, a person replies, the vast majority of hateful comments on here come from people who are from backward African, Middle Eastern, and Asian countries, when they should be more concerned about what's going on in Africa than who marries who in Australia. And referring to the other commenters' countries of origin is another instance of the ad hominem fallacy, where instead of challenging a person's claim and explaining why this law is not evil or why they won't face any kind of consequences, the commenter targets personal traits of their interlocutors, namely where they come from, rather than what they're saying. And this is not a good way to argue a point. And some mixed fallacies to add to the collection. This is a relatively recent post by the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change. It was published on the 18th of June this year. And this one is interesting, not only because its comment section showcases the use of a few logical fallacies to construct seemingly reasonable arguments, but also because it demonstrates how the structure of comments disseminating misinformation evolved to mimic pro-scientific correction attempts. So the post goes as follows. The IPCC is calling on governments and observer organizations to nominate experts to the meeting that will draft the outline of the methodology report on the carbon dioxide removal technologies and carbon capture, utilization, and storage. And to that, one commenter replies, advisories not to swim in the waters of California due to unprecedented cold water temperatures. In summer, by the way, 8.3 degrees Celsius is colder than the North Sea, and don't bother saying it's hot in the UK now, because it's actually just an average summer day after suffering 3 months of cold, wet, and wind, and that organizations like this fail to ever mention. So here we have anecdotal evidence. The fact that water of the coast of California has a certain temperature doesn't tell us anything about broader climate patterns, or is not evidence against the claim that the climate crisis is real. And then there's also another fallacy that we haven't discussed before. It's personal incredulity. And personal incredulity fallacy happens whenever someone finds something too difficult or too complex to understand, and therefore they believe it's not real. So another fallacy in the mix here. And let's have a look at the other comments. So, is this yet more data manipulation occurring? If you have to finger the data to match your intended agenda, then we know there's something seriously wrong with all of the so-called science. And here again, we have a combination of numerous fallacies. There's a loaded question. Is this yet more data manipulation occurring? If somebody would explain, yes, we are still manipulating the data, then of course they would be admitting to something unethical. And if they say, no, we've already stopped manipulating the data, it would mean that they've done this before. So that's a perfect example of a loaded question. Then there's also an indirect ad hominem attack directed at the IPCC, accusing them of fingering the data to match their intended agendas. Then there's the bandwagon fallacy, where the commenter tries to create the impression that a lot of people holds the view that they're trying to put forward. We know there's something seriously wrong with all of the so-called science. And of course, there's an overgeneralization coming from a really small argument to there's something seriously wrong with all of the so-called science. And this faulty generalization is backed with an unreliable source of information, redirecting the readers to some kind of a fishy YouTube account. And there's a third comment here that seems completely unhinged and talks about some kind of a non-existent planet. And there are also loads of content like this that is designed only on creating information noise and making it even more difficult for people to discern what content and what information is reliable and what's not. Okay. Here again, we have some mixed fallacies. The Independent claims that once in 50 years, heat waves now occur 5 times more often and are 1.5 degrees Celsius warmer. And to that, people, internet users, we can't even be sure if all of them are people, because they can be bots and other software. But for the sake of argument, let's call them users. So We have some users demonstrating personal incredulity here. When you see the weather on the news and they say, today we hit a high temperature that we haven't seen since 1955. Oh my God, it was hot then too. Go figure. So again, the person finds the whole complex issue too difficult to understand, and therefore they make it as if it wasn't true. And anecdotal evidence once again. I recall 2, maybe 3 hotter days in June. I must have been asleep for the rest of the month. And it goes on and on. So if you're interested in discovering more fallacies like this, I heartily recommend visiting yourfallacy.is, as this website includes definitions and examples of the 24 most popular logical fallacies, and is a great source of inspiration and teaching materials. So once again, I heartily recommend yourfallacy.is. And this brings us to the second group of processes that I wanted to draw your attention to. If the ubiquity of illogical argumentation wasn't enough on its own already, there are certain unconscious thought patterns that make us reluctant to change our already held beliefs, accept new facts, and act in emergency situations that exacerbate all the world's biggest problems even more. And these are referred to as cognitive biases. And again, I'd like to give you a few examples before proceeding to discussing some ideas on what to do in this kind of complex information environment. First, the confirmation bias. It is a tendency to look for, notice, and agree with ideas that confirm our already held beliefs, and to ignore and dismiss information that conflicts with them. One example of the confirmation bias at work is provided to us by people who only follow news outlets or social media accounts that align with their views, which is a lot of people. But this kind of behavior reinforces their pre-existing opinions while ignoring or dismissing opposing viewpoints. Think about your position on climate crisis, for instance, and try to think, how open would you be to receiving arguments attempting to disprove what you already believe on this topic? Another instance of the confirmation bias at work could be illustrated by a person who believes a certain ethnic or social group is lazy and therefore focuses on reports of instances where members of that group really do appear to be unproductive, ignoring numerous examples that contradict this stereotype. And another bias closely tied with the anecdotal evidence fallacy that we've discussed in the previous part of this talk, makes it even more difficult for us to avoid allowing ourselves to be unduly influenced by our immediate surroundings and personal experience. And this unconscious thought pattern makes us form judgments about the likelihood of occurrence of certain events, such as consequences of the climate crisis, on the basis of what comes to our minds most easily. So, for example, vivid memories, emotions, experiences. And if we can experience with our own bodies that the temperature is not that hot, we might find it very difficult to believe that all in all, globally, temperatures are getting higher and higher. And it's only natural that without awareness of our own thought patterns, we might find it difficult to believe when people tell us that it is getting hotter while we feel with our bodies that it's cold. Still, the thing about availability bias is that social media mechanics exacerbate the adverse effects of this kind of biases on rational decision making even more. because in social media, people tend to be locked in information bubbles. So situations where they encounter only information that conform to and reinforce their own beliefs, especially and it is especially often caused by algorithms that personalize an individual's online experience. So we are presented with, by the algorithms, we are presented with more information that we already want to see. So this way, it's really difficult to be confronted with information that could even potentially convince us that it's the other way around. And finally, we've come to reactance, another cognitive bias that makes it difficult to convince people to change their minds and abandon their irrational beliefs. Reactance is an innate tendency to experience a negative emotional response when people perceive that their freedom is being restricted, and this leads them to do the opposite of what they're being told or encouraged to do. And this seems to be one of the reasons why attempts at convincing people to change their minds by using factual arguments are really often unsuccessful. People simply don't, I mean, of course, not all people, but people don't like being told what to do or what to think, especially if it is being told in a way that makes them feel that their freedom is being restricted. And these were only a few of the most popular logical fallacies and cognitive biases clouding our rational judgments. And if you're interested in discovering more processes like these, you might also want to visit yourbias.is, as this is a website analogous to the one talking about logical fallacies, with the difference that yourbias.is includes a selection of 24 most popular cognitive biases with definitions and examples. And now, coming back to the overarching question of what is to be done about a situation where our rather primitive software becomes incompatible with the complex reality it is supposed to analyze and shape through our decision making, let's move on to discussing measures that can be taken to help drive significant social change towards a more rational future. So, making unconscious processes conscious through educating people about their existence opens up the possibility not to act on those hardwired and ill-serving impulses. And in their 2019 study, Rosenbeck and van der Linden discovered that active inoculation, quote, reduced the perceived reliability of tweets that embedded several common online misinformation strategies, unquote, and designed a simple browser game that shows promising results in immunizing the players against common social media misinformation tactics. And in this context, inoculation refers to exposing people to weakened doses of strategies used to spread misinformation, which makes them more immune to this kind of communication. And even though Rosenbeck and van der Linden focus more on the psychological and social media mechanisms exploited to spread misinformation, I think it is reasonable to assume that inoculation will also work in making people more aware and resistant to linguistic and narrative mechanisms used to cloud rational judgments. And finally, in the dissemination phase of the measures, we can ask the students, we can act ourselves as spreaders of the knowledge about logical fallacies and cognitive biases on social media platforms. And using platforms like this, remember about the numbers that I've mentioned in the beginning. Using platforms like this allows access to over 62% of the total global population. So this creates the possibility of sparking exponential growth in awareness among people, in awareness of our own thinking mechanisms that sometimes cloud our rational judgments. And another benefit of um, practicing and using social media as a platform for discussing logical fallacies and cognitive biases is that a practical application of acquired knowledge is the most effective means of retaining it. So if you're a teacher, doing field activities on social media with students has the potential to influence them and thousands of other users at the same time. And if you're not a teacher, maybe simply a social media user, and you can use this platform for activism. As I do realize that not everyone likes to take direct action, so doing this from the safety of our homes and via social media is a fairly easy way to act, and to act towards making the world a better place, to put it simply. And this is why I began with a remark that this is a utopian idea, because it is an idea that stems from thinking about what could we possibly do to make the situation around us at least a bit better. So getting closer to the end, I would like to mention how I usually teach students about logical fallacies and cognitive biases as part of various courses. And I've actually also kind of demonstrated this in practice already, because I usually begin with explaining what logical fallacies and cognitive biases are, and then I use examples found on social media to illustrate them, as these examples are relevant to 21st century students. And this makes them notice that this kind of knowledge is really practical and worth devoting their time and effort to absorb. And of course, the number of fallacies and biases discussed can be adjusted depending on how much time you have to spend on this topic. And some of the exercises can be assigned as homework, final projects, or skipped. And after the first transmission part, after transmitting the knowledge to them, we activated by playing the bad news browser game designed by Rosenbeck and van der Linden. And I'll show you what the game is about in a moment. But then, apart from activating this knowledge by the browser game, we also use Edpuzzles. Edpuzzle is a platform for creating exercises out of videos. And here, Donald Trump is an absolutely inexhaustible fountain of logical fallacies. He is capable of squeezing a couple of them, several of them into a single sentence. And if you watch his speeches, then you can also play games with students in real time, asking them, why is this part fallacious? Why is this bit logically unsound? And there are also other kinds of interactive exercises that can be introduced in this part. And I would like to emphasize that politicians on all sides of the political spectrum or political divides use logical fallacies in their argumentation to win support. But then again, it's also interesting for the students to see this with their own eyes. And after transmitting and activating this knowledge, we move to step 3, where I ask the students to go to the comments section under any kind of controversial or polarizing issue on social media, and then to identify fallacious and or biased arguments and to explain what's happening without arguing with the commenter. And then the next time we meet, we reflect and discuss the whole experience to make it more meaningful. And numerous students have remarked that they found this knowledge really interesting, readily applicable, and that they thought that it was even life-changing. So I heartily recommend devoting more time or putting more emphasis on teaching people about logical fallacies and cognitive biases. And at the same time, I will also I would also like to make a point that apart from teaching, it is something that ordinary people might find worthwhile to devote their time to. And we'll get back to that in a moment. First, the bad news game that I mentioned. This is the online browser game that was designed by Jon Rosenberg and Sander van der Linden, whose research indicates that players exposed to common online misinformation strategies become more resistant to this form of manipulation. And in the game, the player's task is to spread misinformation and gain online followers using strategies often employed by fake news disseminators in real life, such as impersonating accounts of famous people and institutions, appealing to the followers' emotions, polarizing, sharing conspiracy theories, discrediting, and just plain trolling. So in this game, you read the prompts, and the players are usually presented with two possibilities. Then here on the left-hand side, you have a followers count and a credibility count. And as you progress and invent fake news as well as construct memes, your number of followers grows. And here, spoiler alert, writing comprehensive scientific articles won't gain you as many followers as sharing polarizing propagandist memes does. But experiencing this firsthand really makes students give it a thought, give it some thought. So what can we do about it all? Numerous IPCC experts interviewed in May this year by The Guardian agreed that the climate fight must continue, however high global temperatures rose, because every fraction of a degree avoided would reduce human suffering. And this is something we have the means to achieve. So let's try to raise awareness of thought patterns behind misinformation and irrational decision making, while using social media as a platform to disseminate this knowledge and increase public engagement in solving the world's other pressing problems as well. And it's good to bear in mind that we're not trying to convince the commenters to whom we are responding, and that at least some of them are bots and trolls whose aim is to make you lose your temper and thus appear unreasonable. So we're trying to demonstrate that not everyone is on the climate change denial bandwagon, and allowing the silent majority of users who only scroll through social networking platforms and absorb their content to react to reasonable stances and thus promote them. And if you don't feel like constructing your own response, you can simply post a link to the bias or fallacy a given comment is based on from one of the websites that I've recommended. So yourbias.is or yourfallacy.is. And now you can see on your screens the most important rules of engagement set out in the 2022 Eurostat handbook on handling disinformation. And according to those rules, it's best not to argue with the spreaders of misinformation, avoid repeating false information before providing correct data, or naming the fallacy or bias at work. And some things to do in engaging with spreaders of social media misinformation are to focus on providing accurate information and data, to post results of investigation on disinformation by media and fact checkers, as well as promote media and information literacy, bearing in mind the curse of knowledge fallacy. And the curse of knowledge happens whenever we find something that we already know and understand obvious to everyone else, and therefore we might start assuming that everyone knows it since we know it. So bear in mind that not everyone knows what you know, and try to explain. So why is learning and teaching about logical fallacies and cognitive biases worth your time? In short, because this knowledge has tangible, beneficial effects on numerous areas of our everyday life, regardless whether we're in the field of education or not. But if you are in the academia, it can have even more benefits because knowledge of logical fallacies and cognitive biases can lead to higher quality of arguments and therefore, by extension, higher quality of papers, thesis, research. And it's also preparing the students to living in the era of post-truth. This is also increasing societal resilience to misinformation in the long term. And in the field of academia, it can also, meaning the knowledge of logical fallacies and cognitive biases, is also a great way to demonstrate the unappreciated practicality of linguistics and narratology in everyday life. Moving on to politics. In the realm of politics, knowledge of logical fallacies and cognitive biases can help combat the rapid proliferation of misinformation. And it's not an exaggeration to say that increasing societal resilience to misinformation is a matter of national and even supranational security these days. But even if it wasn't the case, citizens making reasonable rather than emotional choices are fundamental to a more rational and more sustainable future. Finally, consumerism. Exploiting logical fallacies and cognitive biases is at the core of advertising and perpetuates the seemingly endless cycle of rampant consumerism. One of the reasons why people are so susceptible to those messages is that they're unaware of the linguistic and psychological manipulation mechanisms at work. And the awareness of those strategies has the potential to make people make better consumer choices and reduce the amount of waste and pollution that we generate. Finally, in the field of interpersonal relations, being able to notice and refuse to engage with logically fallacious argumentation, as well as refraining from using it ourselves, perhaps this even more, fosters honest, nurturing communication that benefits households, workplaces, and communities by reducing unnecessary conflicts. So I sincerely hope that I've managed to get you interested in in logical fallacies and cognitive biases, as well as their application in everyday life. So thank you very much for the invitation once again. And if you have any questions, write me an email. Thank you very much.